All right. So we are currently on question number 23, and we've got a sociologist talking about the welfare state. Okay, so that's our topic. The welfare state cannot be successfully implemented because it rests on the assumption that human beings are unselfish, a seemingly false assumption. So we've got a false assumption here that makes the welfare state unable to be successfully implemented. Okay. The welfare state is feasible only if, so we had a necessary condition here. The welfare state is feasible only if wage earners are prepared to have their hard earned funds used to help others in greater need. Okay, so if we have the welfare state, this is a test on your necessary and sufficient conditions. If we have the welfare state, that's our sufficient condition, then we know that this is only if wage earners are prepared to help. And I'll do that. I'll make a little dollar sign so we know that they're helping with money. Um, and if people are helping others in greater need, it requires an unselfish attitude. Okay, so help then becomes our sufficient condition for our next statement, which requires, that's necessary. We love our necessary condition. That requires an unselfish attitude. But people innately seek their own well being, especially when the interests of others threaten it. All right, so they've given us um, this little explanation here. And so what the sociologist is trying to say is that we can't create the welfare state. And here's why. Here's this whole breakdown. And so, what's going on here is all of these, sufficient and necessary assumptions, all these statements are supporting the idea that there's a false assumption, and that's why we can't have the welfare state. So let's go ahead and look at our answer choices and see what is the main conclusion here. A, the welfare state will not work. Well, that's pretty much a restatement of what goes on in the very, very first sentence. The welfare state cannot be successfully implemented. And we know that they go on and continue talking about why. So why can it not be successfully implemented? Why will the welfare state not work? Because it rests on a false assumption. And what's that false assumption? They go on and explain all of that down here with necessary and sufficient conditions. So this is looking like a pretty darn good answer. So we'll kind of just like take it up here. We'll kind of check it off and go through the rest of our answer choices. Now, if this was the actual test and you only had a couple minutes left to get to the rest of your questions, I'd recommend, taking this answer if you're feeling really good about it and skipping so that you can at least attempt the other questions and then come back with the time you have left to double check. But, since we've got time here, we'll just go right ahead. B, the welfare state unfairly asks those who work hard to help those in greater need. So the key word here is unfairly, because it definitely does ask people who work hard to help those in greater need. It's required. But do we see the sociologists saying that this is unfair? They're only saying this is feasible only if blah, 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 blah. People innately seek their own well-being. We don't really have any other things indicating that the author or the sociologist believes that this is unfair. So we'll mark out B. C, the assumption that human beings are unselfish is false. So we know that there's a false assumption here, but what's the false assumption? The assumption that gets mentioned is that human beings are unselfish, and that is false. So if it's false that human beings are unselfish, then it is true that human beings are selfish. Okay. So we got the sense that, the assumption that human beings are unselfish is false. We do know that's true, but is that what's being supported in our argument? Our main conclusion question is going to be the thing that is supported with everything else. This statement that the false assumption, that the assumption is false, it is supporting the idea that the welfare state cannot work. It is supporting it. Therefore, it is a premise, not our main conclusion. There's only going to be one thing that is ultimately supported by everything else. And this is not quite it. D, the interests of the less fortunate impinge on the interests of others. So less fortunate, interests of others. Well, what if the others are also less fortunate? I don't know. Kind of random question. Um, when we're thinking about what's going on in this stimulus, we don't really know what's talking about the interests of the less fortunate. We just know that wage earners should be prepared to help greater people in greater need if there is a welfare state. But it doesn't mean that they're directly linking interests of the less fortunate to the interests of others, right? We don't talk about interests whatsoever. And so, a lot of people will get tripped up because they see the word impinge and they're like, what does impinge mean? I'm going to just tell you right now, I have no idea what impinge means, but I'm guessing that it's talking about a relation between these two. And our stimulus does not support that there is a relation, a direct relation. And we're not talking about interest. We're not talking about these interests of the less fortunate and the interest of others being related. Interest is not in here. So we're going to mark out D. E, the welfare state relies on the generosity of wage earners. Okay, so we know the welfare state. In order to have the welfare state, it's only feasible. So it does kind of rely on wage earners having an unselfish attitude because, ultimately they need an unselfish attitude in order to help other people in need. But it depends on how you define generosity, right? And some people would think that this is generosity. Ultimately, we can argue whether generosity is a good word to use here. But what is this statement? This statement is a premise, right? Because we know the sociologist's bottom line is that we can't make the welfare state work. How E relates, it is supporting this argument. The welfare state relies on generosity of wage earners, but people are, the assumption that people are unselfish is a false assumption. So people are selfish. And we cannot have the welfare state if people are not unselfish. So this is doing the supporting. It is supporting the main conclusion rather than being supported. So we'll take A as our answer.